So once again, welcome to the webinar. The title of our webinar is Supporting Your Business Process Initiatives with SharePoint. Since the beginning of the year, we've worked with a number of CIOs in a variety of companies, a variety of industries. As of late, we have been working a lot more closely with business process improvement executives and managers in companies. And we've been working a lot with business process analysts in organizations. And what we have learned as an organization is that the people that are in charge with business process improvement across the organization are really the people that have the pulse on line of business initiatives that relate to enhancing or improving some aspect of the enterprise. So this webinar today is focused heavily at those people where they may be familiar with SharePoint and SharePoint's potential fit to add value in that regard. Kind of the way that SharePoint is positioned, SharePoint is a platform developed by Microsoft that many of you on the call today have implemented across the enterprise. SharePoint has some very basic workflow capabilities inherent to SharePoint itself. Today we're going to be introducing a product called ShareVis that gives you the ability to enhance that capability, that workflow, forms automation and workflow capability inside of SharePoint. And the product ShareVis sits really on top of SharePoint, much like ClipArt sits on top of PowerPoint. So the goal today is that we're going to start with some, let me see, let me get here, some brief introductions. My name is Frank Thomas. I'm with Adaptive Corporation, and I'm joined today by one of my associates, Derek Needing, who's a technical resource with our implementation and services team that goes under the name of Razorleaf. Derek will be doing an actual demonstration, real-time demonstration for us today. In terms of agenda, we'd like to just kind of cover a minute, spend a minute talking about some of the challenges and risks that many of us face in deploying new technology to our organizations. Again, we're going to spend a majority of the webinar today with an actual demonstration by Derek. We're going to touch on also SharePoint 2010. Many of you that joined the call, we had an opportunity to speak with prior to the event today and ask some questions about SharePoint 2010, what is new in SharePoint 2010, what happens if I start an initiative today in the version of SharePoint that our organization owns, and then we migrate to SharePoint 2010, what happens to that investment, what happens to that initiative, and I think that those are reasonable questions, so we want to make sure that that gets addressed. We'll have a brief review after the demonstration, and then certainly allow time at the end of the presentation today for Q&A. So a couple of takeaways today for the event. Actually, there are three of them. This is the first one, and the first one being that SharePoint is an enterprise business process platform. So I think a lot of people, when they're exposed to SharePoint at first, they view it as a place for small work groups, small organizations to manage documents, maybe do some collaboration, create blogs and wikis, and but depending on the size of the organization, is it really an enterprise platform? So we want to make sure that we address that for you today and make you comfortable that SharePoint can be a viable enterprise business process platform. Second takeaway is that by starting today and then migrating to SharePoint 2010, that you're not paying a penalty. Our applications that are created on SharePoint 2003 or SharePoint 2007, regardless of the addition of SharePoint, can be migrated to SharePoint 2010 without needing to recode the applications, and we'll get into that in a little bit more detail as well. And then finally, no hard coding required. So when we talk about ShareVis sitting on top of SharePoint, the demonstration that Derek is going to do for us today will actually show the ability to create a workflow in a designer environment that's really much like Visio. So for those of you that have spent any time defining business process, internal or really any kind of process, I assume that you've had some exposure to Visio. The tool that you're going to see today is much like Visio in the way that it allows us to quickly lay out a business process. The reason that it was implemented that way was that many of our customers wanted to have something that they could put into the hands of the line of business people so that at least the line of business people could kind of draw out a simple process before they engage or start collaborating with IT. Many times in organizations, especially the one that I came from, you sit down with IT and then you try and articulate a process. Maybe you've got some PowerPoint, maybe you've got some PDFs, but it's really kind of disjointed. And this tool, as you will see, allows the line of business people a simple mechanism to at least initiate the process. So the challenges that everybody faces in implementing applications in the SharePoint environment today is that SharePoint requires hard coding. So you need to have a developer on staff that understands Visual Basic, understands C++, and has some mechanism to develop actual code. Secondly, if you want the opportunity to connect to Active Directory so that as your workflows are running and you add resources or you change resources in the organization, you want the ability to make that change at the Active Directory level so that the next time the workflow runs, it sees that I have a new resource that is in that department or in that group, and I should be directing this request to that new resource. You don't want to have to make those kinds of changes at the program level. So what people are looking for are applications that give them the opportunity to connect at the Active Directory level. Next, companies that we've talked to are looking for the ability to easily instantiate different views of forms. So this being that many times in a process you're collecting maybe some proprietary information, maybe a social security number or a tax ID number or whatever at step 1 in a process, but you really don't want that information shared at step 2, step 3, step 4 in the process because, number 1, it's not relevant to that step in the process, and number 2, it's confidential. At the event, a number of you on the call today are from the life sciences or medical or hospital industry. You know, the ability to expose or share that kind of information downstream is prohibited by regulatory compliance standards. Lack of flexibility in workflow. The out-of-the-box solution of SharePoint gives you the ability to do primarily serial processes or parallel processes, but in some case, what if I want some combination of serial and parallel processes? The out-of-the-box SharePoint solution does not give you that that ability, in addition to nested workflows, so a workflow that calls another workflow. And then lastly, you know, SharePoint 2010 is on the horizon. We all know that it's coming up. It's a real exciting capability that SharePoint 2010 brings to the table. A lot of implications. We'll be talking about that a little bit more later. And so what does that mean if I'm on SharePoint 2003, 2007? Where do I start and when do I start? Do I pay a penalty? So the risks are obviously long implementation, high customization, resource requirements. Nobody has the time. We don't have the resources. And really the biggest risk that everybody has communicated to us is poor user adoption. At the end of the day, this thing has to be used whatever it is. And I can't afford to provide training. I need to basically take a process that today we're doing with Excel and creating an Excel or filling out an Excel form, attaching it to an email and sending the email. My people know how to do that today. Or a piece of paper. My people know how to fill out the piece of paper and then route it through a process. I need to be able to take that kind of thing that we're doing today and instantiate that in an environment that I can literally tell them, double-click on this icon on your desktop or go into Outlook and double-click here, and that will bring up a form, and you fill out the fields that are highlighted in yellow, for example, right? So user adoption is absolutely critical. Around here we call it the WIFM factor, W-I-F-M, the what's in it for me. So at the end of the day, the people have to be able to use this application quicker to get their jobs done faster. Just a moment on SharePoint. I think many of you on the call today are familiar with SharePoint as an architecture and some of the capabilities that it has. SharePoint touches on areas of collaboration. Certain versions of SharePoint include a portal. Certain editions of SharePoint included an advanced web search engine, content management, some basic business process, and business intelligence. This capability in SharePoint can be exposed to intranets, extranets, and websites. Many people now are starting to use SharePoint as the content management engine to drive their websites, intranets, and extranets. Today we're going to be focused heavily on business process automation. List of some of our customers that we've worked with to date that have some pretty significant SharePoint initiatives. What you'll see is that this list really kind of spans the gamut. It goes from pretty large name brand companies that I think most of us recognize, Mercedes, American Airlines and such, down to some smaller companies that maybe you've never heard of before. And I think that what that says is that SharePoint, and by virtue of our association with SharePoint, ShareVis as well, scales very, very well. It has a compelling value prop, no matter if you're a large multinational global company like American Airlines or maybe a smaller, more localized corporation like GeoKinetics. So with that, I'd like to turn over the remainder of the presentation to Derek Needing, who's going to run us through an example process using ShareVis. Derek?
All right, thank you, Frank. I'll wait to get control, and then we'll go through this step by step. All right. Okay, so we should be all set. So let's go through and start talking about, you know what, let me change my screen resolution here. Hold on, bear with me one second. I think I'm a little bit, there we go. Okay, we'll leave it at that. So let's go through our live demo of ShareVis. We'll talk about a lot of the things that Frank talked about, some of the challenges that you see with SharePoint out-of-the-box workflows and how ShareVis changes that. And we'll be able to show you processes that I've created in advance, and we'll even create some processes or make some changes to process live online. So a couple things to get started. Let's talk a little bit about how ShareVis works, how it's architected, what's involved with ShareVis, and those sort of things. Frank mentioned, and it's important for you to note, that ShareVis runs wholly on top of SharePoint, so everything that you're doing through ShareVis happens in SharePoint. So whenever someone is entering information into a form, all that information is being stored in SharePoint. Whenever someone gets an assignment, that assignment is visible in SharePoint. All the security is SharePoint security, so you don't have to have additional security on top of SharePoint. It all happens through normal SharePoint activities. And so the nice thing about that is it eases administration, of course, because you don't have this additional administration you have to do. But the other thing is, you know, like all of that data being stored in SharePoint, what that means is we can now use SharePoint functionality to kind of slice and dice the data if you want to put some KPIs or some executive dashboards around some data to see how a process is working or that sort of thing. You can do that very easily using normal SharePoint tools. You want to create some Excel services reports or maybe some SQL reporting services, complex reports. You can do all of that stuff with the data that's in ShareVis. So a ShareVis process will generally consist of two components. Those two components are a form front end and a workflow back end. And the reason I say generally is that there are cases when we won't have a form front end. So it may be that you have a workflow process that's all about flowing a document through the company, and so there's no need for a form front end. The document is self-explanatory. It can just go on its own. So in those cases, you wouldn't have a form front end. You would just have the workflow back end. In the demo that we're going to do today, we're going to look mostly at the form front end processes because they're a little more complex and they show some of the more features of ShareVis. So ShareVis forms are authored in a tool that's called Microsoft Office InfoPath. It's not a Share